So this is week 2 of our Monty Python examination or whatever. So if anyone is listening to this one first, last week was our first Monty Python episode where, we did it. There's like the 4 seasons. So we watched one episode from season 1 and one from season 2. And this week we're going to do one from season 3 and one from season 4. And last week we just talked about our personal experiences with Monty Python, where this week I did the proper research and went and looked into Monty Python stuff. Which, I feel like if you really wanted to, you could read about Monty Python till the end of time. There is so much about this show. It's funny because we usually do these like obscure shows, right? So if I can find anything about them, that's like a bonus. Where with this, I had to try to sort of condense this down into like what's actually useful information about Monty Python. So let's see here. I got a lot of notes here, but I'll try to streamline it a bit. So there were 45 episodes that aired over 4 series from 1969 to 1974, plus 2 episodes for German TV. Apparently some German TV guy saw it and liked it and actually arranged for them to make some special episodes for German TV. And
German?
Yeah.
In German?
One of them was overdubbed into German.
Oh, okay.
But the other one, if I'm reading right, was performed, I guess, by the Python guys in German. I guess. I don't know. I didn't look those up, but they're out there, I guess, if you really want to get weird with your Monty Python. As we, have been going through, this is because I'm saying this is part 2, but it's really like part whatever of our getting to the beginnings of Monty Python. So the 6 members met through various university and television things as we've examined the different shows they were on together. So basically, though, to boil it all down of what happened with Monty Python is they had worked on these shows together, particularly the Frost Report everybody worked on, but they worked together in various pairs and back in their respective universities. So they were offered 2 different shows. Like one group offered one show, the other group offered another show. But since the BBC is a relatively small, self-contained place, everyone was all there together. So the 6 Python guys themselves kind of met and arranged. They decided like we should just do one show together, and they're the ones who pitched that idea. So the powers that be were like, oh, all right, instead of 2 shows, we'll just make one super show with everybody. And the team intended their humor to be impossible to categorize, which I'd say they did a pretty good job. Because especially reading through this stuff, man, like, this happened a lot when I was in New York because a lot of the people I knew there were comedians. Hearing comedians discuss and like dissect comedy is the least funny thing you could ever hear in your life. It's just, I got so tired of hearing about the nature of a joke and blah, blah, blah. And it's like that when you try to read about Monty Python, people trying to explain the style of the show and why it's funny or why it's unique, and it's just like
they've been doing it since Shakespeare's day.
Yeah, it takes all the energy out of it, that's for sure. I'm not saying you should never examine it, but I'm not interested in reading the examination. So yeah, just reading that it was impossible to categorize, I think that's fair enough. And like that the term Python-esque kind of came up because it's easier than trying to explain what Monty Python is. It's that. It's its own thing. Although, we might have to check this show out because the one show that they point to several times as if there is any direct inspiration for Monty Python, it's this guy named Spike Milligan who had a show.
Spike Milligan. Yeah, I know him.
He had a show called Q. Have you ever seen that?
Don't know.
So apparently Q was, like we were talking about breaking the fourth wall last week and we watched, Garth Marenghi's Dark Place and stuff. Apparently this show Q was like the first show to do that, to just break the conventions of TV, where like if a sketch was going badly, sometimes Spike Milligan, he would just wander off and just be like, did I write this? This is terrible. Like he wouldn't end it, he would just stop. And the Python guys thought that was really funny. So their version of that was kind of like they found one of the big weaknesses to sketch comedy is the punchline. If it has a bad punchline at the end, it can ruin the whole sketch. So they were like, well, let's just not have punchlines. Let's just wander off, like sort of like Spike Milligan did. But their way of doing that is that stream of consciousness, one sketch goes into the next, or one of those weird animations gets you to the next one. So it's not that there's never an end to the sketch, but that's not the important part. And then Mr. Show later in the 90s clearly did that as well. So yeah, it's kind of neat because it's like, yeah, just how important is it to have a punchline? Maybe just a funny premise and some weird shit happening in total is more interesting, more entertaining, and funnier. And I think they're right, because it is like a line in the sand when you see those older, especially like the radio duos and stuff from the golden age. It's very punchliney, and Monty Python sure isn't. Like we remember the dead parrot and stuff, but how did that end? Who knows? Who cares? And that's not the funny part. As far as the title goes, and there's a lot of all this information there's a lot of variance depending on which Python is telling the story. There's not a lot of distinct information about Monty Python. It's like one guy said this, one guy said that. So any of this information could be wrong or could be half-truths or whatever. But basically, as far as the weird title, what I could gather is because the six of them were always at the BBC and running around and doing stuff, and they were just, a weird energy, to the Monty Python people compared to everyone else at BBC. So one of the executives suggested that using the title of a circus because those guys were like a circus, just watching them doing all their weird shit. And they changed it to Flying. They kind of like that, but they changed it to Flying Circus because that was the nickname of this group of World War I pilots. So right out of the gate, that's like one of these weird subversive Monty Python things. Flying Circus, if you don't know that it's a World War I reference, is just circus stuff like the BBC guy asked for. But to them, it meant World War I.
Flying aces.
Yeah, which is way more, just darker and weirder. The Flying Circus is not the circus. And then the name Monty Python, they had a bunch of versions of that type of name, but they thought it just sounded like a sleazy manager. Monty Python's Flying Circus, like they're all under the employ of this guy, Monty Python, who's nobody, but it's just, just a good name, just a good, funny, weird name. But they had a bunch of alternate titles, which are really strange. And some of these were used later in the show, like that episode, the very first episode, Whither Canada. That was one of their names that they wanted, that they pitched, Whither Canada. The Nose Show, Ow, It's Colin Plint, A Horse, a Spoon, and a Basin, Owl Stretching Time, and The Toad Elevating Moment, that was also in one of the episodes we watched. So all just nonsense titles, that's all they really wanted was a weird title, so... Monty Python, obviously, Monty Python's Flying Circus doesn't really mean anything, even if you dissect where the pieces came from. All that's important is that it's a weird title. And it had a slow build with audiences in Britain, but did okay, like it was going somewhere. But apparently there was people in the BBC who disliked it immediately, because right from the get-go, it was supposed to be an adult late-night show with like Terry Gilliam's weird nude animations and just the weird shit that happens. But it was described by some BBC bigwig as disgusting and nihilistic. And in particular, they mentioned that funeral parlor sketch we saw last week, that, the whole idea was the Queen's not watching anymore, let's just be offensive. Like, the Python guys knew that wasn't funny. The point was for it to be offensive, or they're talking about eating the guy's dead mother. But BBC people were like, disgusting and nihilistic, Like, it's like, okay, I mean, yes, but, you're missing the point. But apparently after season 2, the show got more censored. So these ones we're watching now, this is because they had a lot of freedom, obviously, or they wouldn't have ever been able to make a show so weird. But these ones we're watching now were a little more under the magnifying glass.
Under the thumb of the big wigs.
So I guess we'll see if we notice that. So the reason John Cleese left after series 3, he was talking about leaving even after the second season, but he stayed for a third. But it was because he feared that the sketches were starting to be rehashes of each other, which I think is probably a fair thing. You can only do so many sketch shows before it starts getting to be kind of samey, so he didn't want that to happen. And apparently when they did writing, they kind of reverted back to their old university. But basically, Cleese and Chapman, because they met at, what school was it they went to?
Oxford or Cambridge, which one were they?
No, they were Cambridge, right? The Cambridge Footlights. So Cleese and Chapman, they wrote together. And Palin and Jones, since they met at Oxford, they would write together. And Eric Idle would usually write by himself. And John Cleese said you can kind of tell who wrote what. Like if it was an overly aggressive sketch with a lot of people like hurling verbal abuse at each other, it was him and Chapman. If it starts with like a pan across a pastoral scene, that was always Palin and Jones. And if it was obsessed with wordplay, that was Eric Idle. Like that one we watched with the people who only say the start of sentences, the middle of sentences, and ends of sentences. Or like he had one about a guy who pronounces all C's as B's, like anything like that is Eric Idle. So that's how you can basically figure out who wrote what in Monty Python. But because Cleese and Chapman were the duo that worked together a lot, apparently Graham Chapman he had like alcohol problems all throughout, even when he was in university and up to this point, and it was just getting increasingly hard to work with him because of his alcoholism. But the nice news is, by the time they did Life of Brian in 1979, he was sober, and he died in 89 from cancer, but his last 10 years he was sober. So he got it together, but at this period, John Cleese, with the, not wanting to outstay his welcome and just tired of dealing with this drunk guy, that's why he left. So it's like, okay, I mean, that all kind of makes sense. Oh yeah, and I guess I should just mention Carol Cleveland, because, they often refer to her as the seventh Python. And she really was just a model known for Monty Python. She didn't do anything else, but but she did do an important role in Monty Python. Also, I guess Terry Gilliam, so we never really followed him too closely, but he started on...
He's the American guy, isn't he?
Yeah. And I didn't write it down because I don't remember now, but he started in like a magazine, I believe. He was like an illustrator for some magazine that John Cleese was involved with. And then he moved to England and started doing animations. So when the Python guys decided to combine, they also brought him in. They're like, this guy does these weird animations. And particularly if we're going to do this stream of consciousness thing, if we need a way out of a sketch to link it to the next sketch, what could be better than just his weird animations? Because then you don't even realize there wasn't a punchline when you're watching this weird stuff that this guy made. So that's where he came from. So then as far as coming over to North America, the show was considered too British for American TV, but it became a fixture on CBC. So it started in '69 in England. By fall of 1970, it was playing on the CBC, and that's where these Americans that lived in the northern states that would get Canadian TV signals, that's when they first started being able to see Monty Python. So that's kind of interesting. Like, they didn't really start airing it properly till 1974 in America. So we were well ahead of the curve in Canada. So it's not coincidence that you and all your college buddies, all were into Monty Python, because Canada is really what broke it into North America. And America took ages. However, once they started airing it in the States on like PBS and stuff, it gained popularity really quickly. So even though it only really started in 1974, by the time Holy Grail came out in 1975, it did great in both continents. And apparently even Elvis, in his final days, confined to Graceland, he died in 77, I'm going to say?
Yeah, I think it was 77, yeah.
But apparently when he was, just trapped in Graceland, never left, hardly saw anybody, but the people who did see him and talk to him said he often talked about his favorite Monty Python sketches. So he was just holed up in there, eating his weird, bacon and peanut butter deep fried sandwiches and watching Monty Python. So, I mean, it's just a weird thing to mention, but it's like, I mean, that is kind of a testament to how immediately cool Monty Python was, that even fucking Elvis was like, what is this show? Who will talk to me about this weird show that I've been watching? And again, like, I don't know, I just picked, what are we watching? We're watching the first episode of season 3 and the last episode of season 4. So we'll just see what happens, what sketches we get, who knows. But I was thinking maybe next week, maybe we probably won't even do a podcast about this, but maybe next week I'll just dig up some of the really famous Monty Pythons before we leave Monty Python land, just so we can...
Yeah, and maybe see if you can find Spike Mulligan.
Yeah.
Q.
I think we'll do a whole podcast about that, because, I am curious.
Yeah. I know the name, but I really can't say what I know about him.
Right.
But,
and that is, since that's kind of the purview of this podcast anyway, is to discover old TV, this seems like especially worth examining if the Monty Python guys vouch for him. I mean, hey, how bad can that be? But as far as famous sketches, because we didn't really hit any of the really famous ones last week, and who knows what we'll get this week, but they made a list of the 50 greatest British sketches of all time in 2005, Channel 4 did, and 5 Monty Python sketches made the list, and I do feel like they pretty much nailed it here as far as top 5 most famous Monty Python sketches. There's Dead Parrot, The Spanish Inquisition.
Oh, yes.
No one expects. The Ministry of Silly Walks.
Yes.
Nudge Nudge.
Yes.
Nudge Nudge. Wink and a nudge. And the Lumberjack song.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. I mean, because I figure you could probably dig up another 20 famous sketches, but as far as the 5 big ones that everybody knows, like, that they pretty
would
much
be them.
So maybe next week, just for us, just not even on the podcast, I'll just find those ones. We'll just watch those because why not watch them again? But yeah, so for this week, if anyone's watching along at home, like I said, it is season 3, episode 1, and season 4, episode 6, because there was only 6 episodes, very short season. So Wicker's World and Party Political Broadcast. So this is not only with the BBC paying more attention and potentially censoring the show a little, but this season 4 one is after John Cleese left. So just see, I assume it's all going to be great though.
And let's compare. Yeah, we'll be able to compare like the beginning and the end.
And last week, went well. I mean, even though they were more obscure episodes, they're great. They're Monty Python. You can't go wrong. So here we go. So for example, right here, right away, camera panning across a pastoral scene, like that's now we know that's Palin and Jones. We know that. And if people are yelling at each other later, that'll be...
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting information.
Yeah, because you can kind of envision it. And like how Eric Idle always did those weird wordplay ones, because like, yeah, okay, I know which ones those are too. It's kind of funny.
Well,
So yeah, I didn't expect the difference between the first half of Monty Python and the second half to be so distinct, but those definitely felt different.
yeah, they were, especially that last one. Like, that was their last show. Like, that was really bizarre.
Yeah, again, it's just only 6 episodes with the non-John Cleese stuff, but and it said they didn't get into details. I'm sure I could have found the details somewhere, but they did say they intended to do a full 13-episode season and they cut it short. Maybe that's why. Maybe they were like, yeah, man, fucking the wheels have fallen off this thing.
Yeah, because that last show was like very... Like, a whole lot of them are kind of loose-ended anyway, but that was really loose-ended. That looked like it was just like... let's just throw anything on here.
Although I was saying, though, like how it's still very elaborate. Like that first bit about the worst family in England or whatever, like a very complicated set and the timing and the props of like ironing things. Like they put a lot of work into it, but conceptually it's like, it just wasn't clicking. And it's funny, that thing John Cleese said about the different styles of sketches and how he was worried they were getting repetitious. Like the Eric Idle ones in particular that are about wordplay. So yeah, we saw the people who say the start of sentences, then the letters that are different or whatever.
That whole last show was very wordy.
And like, by the time, especially that one of like people that end each other's sentences, I could just imagine John Cleese being in the writing room like again? We're doing this again?
And when they just did all that kind of crap on the Liberal Party. I presume the Liberal Party might have been in power at the time in Britain. I really don't know. But it was just kind of like, let's just say a bunch of crap about the Liberal Party.
Yeah.
And then they did. And they were even laughing at the end. And it wasn't like as if it was a controlled laughter as part of the skit. It was just like, whatever.
And I guess that kind of ties into like the Frost Report and stuff. But yeah, like political humor, it's just hard to do because it's just a tiresome topic, no matter what tack you take on it. But yeah, and even the episode 3 one we watched with the saga, like the feeling I got from that was, now that they're 3 seasons in, it's like at the start they wanted to subvert comedy, so they did weird stuff you wouldn't expect. But by the time you get to season 3, now you've got to subvert your subversion because people already are used to the weird stuff you did. So you're getting double weird. And like I found that one really like legitimately hard to follow. It was like complicated. Like I feel like it's like I was saying with like Mr. Show. I bet if I watched all of the Monty Pythons and like episodes like that with the Norrell saga, like I bet the second time and then like the third time, you're probably noticing all kinds of connections and stuff. But the first time, that's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
It's not so much funny. It's like clever more than funny and difficult. So yeah, the early Monty Pythons do seem like they were better, but But I guess that makes sense. Like if you're gonna have like a fresh new take on comedy, how fresh is it gonna be 3 or 4 years later?
But that could be part of its longevity, though, is when you finish watching one, like of those two that we just watched there. It's like, instead of just saying, oh my God, like I'll never watch that again, it's like, now I think I might watch that again and see what were the connections, like what did I miss there?
Right.
Because it seemed to have more depth to it than just being superficial.
Yeah,
like one level. There was stuff going on there that you just couldn't possibly grasp just with one viewing.
And like I was asking you in between, because they were making so many jokes about the BBC and their historical sagas, and like people don't want to see that when they get home from work, and then tying in promotional material for Malden and just all this stuff that it just requires way too much knowledge about what you might catch on BBC in the early 70s that I just don't have. I just don't know. I'm like having to assume things, but then when you're that deep in your own head, it's hard to laugh because you're too busy trying to figure out the context of what's happening. But that is like, that's kind of what I feared might happen last week, of just picking random episodes where I was like, maybe we'll get some duds that just will be weird and will be just not the classics. But then last week went really well. This week was more, again, it happens with every show. I mean, you could just get that weird episode of Kids in the Hall, that weird episode of whatever, it's just a weird one, more so than a funny one. But yeah, and definitely, because I remember just doing the initial brief research. Like last week, I was so confused to learn that John Cleese wanted to leave and then did leave. But now, as you see, even just one episode from each season, it's like, yeah, I'm starting to understand his perspective a lot more. Like, the party can't last forever. You can't change comedy every year. They did it. They changed comedy. Now get out while the getting's good. And that is kind of how it felt here, particularly by that season 4. It is like, and they apparently all got on board with that. And then I think it was good that then they moved on, and like the year after that, they made Holy Grail. Like that was the next step. Go on, make the movies. Because that was my initial feeling too, was like, wow, only 4 seasons and one of them is truncated? I thought there was more Monty Python. But maybe that was all the Monty Python that there needed to be, Where I was saying I was concerned in some ways to dig too deep into Monty Python because you don't want to take the sheen off of your memories. But I don't think that happened. It does just confirm that there are some weird episodes. They're not all gold. There's a reason why we remember the big sketches.
And they developed, though, because when you compare that to what we saw last week, the beginnings, and now we're at the end, those ending shows were not the same as the beginning, which oftentimes what you see with television shows is just the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, and then it dies because it's just complete repetition. This was not complete repetition.
Yeah.
This just kept getting weirder and weirder and weirder.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Like, yeah, there was like small elements that recur, like the weird wordplay stuff, or just sort of premises that are sort of similar, but there's certainly no formula.
Yeah.
Like, if anything, the formula just unraveled more and more and more.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I certainly couldn't say, oh, yeah, did that ever get... Oh, man, that was just the same thing again and again. It wasn't.
Yeah,
that was completely different.
Yeah, you wouldn't say, like, oh, I saw that coming. Like, no, you didn't. You definitely didn't. Maybe it's kind of like, it's like the different art forms. It's like there's the ones that you get better as you're older and the ones that you're better when you're younger. Like, maybe if you're writing a big epic drama, you're better at that when you're older because you're more considered and you have a better worldview. But I always think of, like, music. No band's best album is the 10th album. It's the first and the second one are when they were young and they were go-getters and they really had something going, and then it devalues. Maybe comedy is like that too. Like, what is the chances that the 10th season of something is funnier than the first?
Yeah.
It's probably not.
And to keep up that level of, and now for something completely different, to keep up that level of really creating something completely different, I don't know how you can do it so maybe year 4. That was, they said, you know what? This is it.
Yeah.
Like, we've gotten so weird. Like that skit, I'd seen that one before on Jean-Paul Sartre. That just slayed me. Those old washerwomen all knowing Jean-Paul Sartre. God.
Yeah, that probably was the best of the ones that we saw. And it was, again, impressive how they work it into the Norwegian saga, where now the old ladies are in there. But they didn't just show up. Like, they kind of established that they're on their way to go talk to Jean-Paul Sartre. So they're on a raft. So it kind of, in a weird way, makes sense.
Yeah, it fits, of course. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they end up in Iceland if they took the wrong turn?
And then, yeah, just that whole thing of they just have some philosophical argument about Jean-Paul Sartre. So they go through this whole epic journey just to talk to him for a second. Like, I mean, man such remaining, did it mean this? We. She told you. Yeah. But that's one thing, too, that it's...
And Mrs. Sartre, I just loved her.
Yeah.
Muriel Sartre with a cigarette hanging out of her mouth.
He's all right in the morning, but by noon he's home. That reminded me, too, a lot of Kids in the Hall.
Loved it.
Like, Kids in the Hall, definitely. They're, kind of like when they dress up like women is absolutely a Monty Python, thing.
Well, and if you've ever read anything about, like, Jean-Paul Sartre and his Marxism, he seems so dry and droll, and yet here he's married to this slattern with the cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and they had been off to some French Riviera and met up with the British washerwoman lady and her husband, and they just were the best of friends. Like, it puts a whole new slant on somebody who you think is such a boring philosopher.
I was thinking, too, just as far in general, too, of like, maybe these last ones aren't as great as the first ones, but it's also something that it's kind of weirdly unfair that the world just does to creators in general, is you make some amazing thing. You do this amazing, like, bam, everybody loves it. You've changed the landscape, Now do it again. And now do it again. And now do it again. It's like, can't you just be a genius who changes the face of comedy one time? How many times do you have to do it? So it's just one of those things that even though those episodes clearly weren't as good, to me it doesn't take any of the sheen.
I wouldn't say they weren't as good. They were just different, and they were operating on a whole different level than what the earlier ones were.
Yeah, so that's where, like, I would say it didn't take any of the sheen off of Monty Python, because it's not like they're phoning it in. If anything, they might be trying too hard, and it made it confusing. So.
But again, it's the kind of thing that, like some of those shows that we've watched before, like I've watched them, and I said, oh God, they're pretty droll. I would never bother watching them again. But those last episodes that we saw were so bizarre that, yes, I would watch those again, because I think there's 2 or 3 different levels of stuff going on there. As I said earlier, you can't possibly get that with one viewing.
Yeah. It's kind of like, this would be an awful thing to do, to ruin Monty Python for yourself, but I remember in high school I don't remember which play it was, Midsummer Night's Dream maybe, but some Shakespeare play where the way they had arranged the book was on the right page was the play, and on the left page, across from it, was explanations of everything.
Interpretations, yeah.
Which is that weird catch-22 of Shakespeare. There's just no way to truly understand it anymore, because you can't just watch it because you don't understand it, but if you dissect it to that degree, you're also not enjoying it like it was intended. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And it could be, maybe Monty Python's kind of like that too. If you really did want to, I bet somebody's written a book where they went through every sketch with a fine-tooth comb and could explain to you every reference, but that's not. But
then you blow it, really. You need to look at it the way Shakespeare's people watched his plays. You had the plebs down in the front who were, the uneducated, the guys off the street who were watching the body humor in it. Then you had the middle guys, sort of, semi-literate, who were picking up a different level of it, and then you had the highbrows who were picking up the real,
maybe
stuff.
Monty Python kind of is like that too, where I was kind of had half an eye on this idea that they were more censored, and it's like, I guess this maybe is a little less intense than the early ones, but then there's that sketch in the 4th season where Terry Jones just got fucking stabbed and is just spurting blood everywhere for like 4 straight minutes. He's just bleeding everywhere. So it's like, that's like if you're not getting the highbrow jokes, you're going to laugh at the
You're gonna
absurd
laugh
amounts of blood.
at the absurdity. But see, on a deeper level, they were taking a crack at the health system.
Right.
In Britain, more important to fill out that paperwork than just stop the guy bleeding all over your carpet.
And I love too that the paperwork wasn't even relevant. It's like, yeah, even I knew that one. You didn't know the answer to that? It's, you know.
Something from the Merchant of Venice. So that's what I mean when I'm saying they're on different levels.
Yeah.
See, that was a direct attack at the government. And of course, that whole show was about the Liberal Party, which as I said, I presume was in power at the time. But if you didn't pick up on that, or you knew nothing about the health system, the national health in Britain, yeah, you'd be laughing at Terry Jones there bleeding all over the place, and the doctor just being so in another world, and his nurses outside stabbing people and shooting people.
Well, there is too. I mean, as far as the elaborate production goes, there is like the one I especially like. There's a lot of stuff that was like complicated, and like for the saga, they literally went out and filmed and all this stuff. But one of those like most terrible families in Britain, where their cat was halfway out the wall, is just someone with a cat puppet, and they smack it as they walk by. Like to me, that was I like that mix of like, yeah, the highbrow stuff, but then just the lowbrow, just dumb
and
shit.
Weird stuff like the opening of the saga, then the Icelandic saga, and what do you see Terry Jones sitting nude at his piano? And how many times have we seen that throughout the whole series?
So I was thinking next week we won't do a podcast about it, but I'll just dig up some of the more famous Monty Pythons, and we'll just have a nice little Monty Python just to finish this all off, bring it in for a landing. Because now that I've watched these, not only do I want to see some of the famous sketches again, but I think it'll be interesting to see, like, you know, the Spam sketch. What were the other sketches? Like, what else happened in that episode around that stuff? Because as non sequitur and as stream of consciousness as it is, it always does tend to meld together. So yeah, next week we'll just take an off week and just watch some fucking Monty Python.
Okay, I'm game for that.
Cool.